The world isn't what it used to be. Followers of Jesus are feeling more and more like strangers, aliens in a world that's not our home, as our culture becomes less and less Christian. It's true, Christians are moving to the margins of culture. But this is nothing new. Christianity has always been counterculture. For those feeling the squeeze and wondering what to do, take heart. The answers are there, just waiting for us. And if we know that light shines brightest in the darkness, why be afraid of the dark?
Grace, it's good to be with you this weekend, whatever campus you're joining at. If you're watching online, we're glad you are with us. And my name is Jake. I'm one of the pastors here at the Pickerington campus and want to welcome you as we're continuing a conversation we started a few weeks back called Living in Babylon, where we're basically asking the question, how do we live a Jesus-centered life for those of us who are Christians in a world that doesn't care? And not only a world that doesn't care, but I think if you're a Christian, you feel this, I feel this, that sometimes our values seem not just different than that of cultures, but feel sometimes contradictory. And it's not just that we have to do a different thing, but sometimes it feels like we're swimming upstream. And what does it look like to live in that day and age? And we're processing that question through the lens of Scripture. To say, let's look at this book called Daniel, where there was God's people who were initially in their place, Israel. They were pulled out of that and brought into captivity and exile in this place called Babylon, which is modern day Iraq. And they had to learn how to live in a place that wasn't oriented towards the things of God, that didn't care about honoring God, honoring Yahweh the way that they were able to in their old space and place. And so literal Babylon for them, but for us, we're saying, hey, we have metaphorical Babylons. We have places where we feel like we're outside of the norm if we're following God. In fact, if you have your notes, you can turn to the back and follow along. Here's what we said about Babylon for us. It's environments where living for God puts you outside the norm. Environments where living for God puts you outside the norm. I could spell out a lot of these, but you know where these are. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your friend group. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's on the team that you're on. It could be a lot of different environments, but those that living for God would put you outside of the norm. In week one, we looked at a guy named Daniel, and we looked at the story where initially when he was just a teenager, he had the chance to either kind of stand for God or not, and he chose to stand for God. And we said in that conversation, as Christians living in Babylon, we need to fight to follow God. No matter where, no matter with who, no matter when, we should have a disposition that says, I'll fight to follow God. Last week, we looked at three guys with awesome names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they had the same sort of situation. Are you going to follow God or not? Are you going to bow to the king of Babylon, or are you going to bow to the king of the world and Yahweh? They chose not to bow to the king of Babylon, and we said in that, hey, we need to have an obedience to us that says obedience is up to us, results are up to God. Let's do our part, and God's going to do what he's going to do. Now, this week, I think it's going to be an important conversation within this series of conversations, and here's why. We've said let's fight to follow God, and obedience is up to us, and results are up to God. I think this week is going to be a mirror kind of up to ourselves to go, do we have the right stuff in us, if we're believers, to live in Babylon and to thrive in Babylon? Do we have the courage it takes to actually take the steps and to say the things and to be honest and to be faithful in the different environments that we need to be in? So we're going to have a conversation about courage by, again, looking at Scripture in the book of Daniel. So to get there, I want to tell you a time where I did not have courage. In fact, a lot of times I'd like to think that those of us who are in leadership here at Grace, you'd say, I like those people and I want to follow them as they follow God, but I don't think this will earn me any of those chips as I share this story with you today, all right? So it was in fifth grade, and I was dating a girl, or I wanted to date a girl who would be my second girlfriend, all right? I don't know why I was dating in fifth grade, but I was, all right? So Harmon Middle School, all the way back when, and there was this girl named Morgan who I had lunch with, and I was like, she's pretty cute, or whatever fifth grade me thought, and so I was like, I should do the courageous thing that any good guy would do, and I should ask my friend to go ask her out for me. And so I did, and thankfully she said yes. And so at that time, like my understanding of a relationship and if I was dating somebody, it was so that I could say that I was dating you, but like that was the end of it, right? It didn't really mean anything, but I could say that and you could say that. And so that's what I thought a relationship was. But the next day, I'm sitting at lunch with my friends, as I always do. We're having a good time. We're talking about whatever. And all of a sudden, Morgan comes up with her friends and sits right next to me. And I'm like, this is too much commitment. I'm like, I did not sign up for this, so I'm like, man, this might be bad. And then went to recess, and recess was like my jam. You know, I'd play sports, I'd play whatever I wanted to play. And I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go and do that. But Morgan was with me like by my hip the whole time, and she had to like be on my team, and I'm like, this is bad. And so I was rethinking the whole thing. But a couple days later, I'm shooting hoops at my house. We had a basketball kind of hoop in our driveway, and all of a sudden I see in the distance these motorized scooters just kind of rolling through the neighborhood. You remember when those were a thing? They were rolling through, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, that's Morgan. And so she pulled up with her friends, and all of a sudden she shows up at my house, and thankfully I had practice a few minutes later, so I had to leave and go and do that. And then a couple days later, I kid you not, I'm in my basement, and I'm with one of my good friends, and the phone rings. And this was the time of home phones, and so it was almost never for me. You know, I'm a fifth grader, nobody calls me, and the one person that probably would was in the basement with me, so I didn't think it was for me. But my parents answer, yell down, hey, Jake, phone's for you. So in that moment, I'm like, okay, I don't know who it is. I pick up the phone, and she's like, hey, Jake, it's Morgan. And I just hang up the phone. I knew, I was like, I don't even want to be in this relationship anymore. I didn't know what to do, so I just hung up the phone. And so in that moment, my friend knew the situation, so I was like, man, I don't know what to do, and I don't want to be in this relationship, but I know I got to end it, and I don't really know. And so she calls back, because she probably thought I was a decent person and didn't just hang up, and something happened with the phone. So she calls back, and I see it on caller ID, and I'm like, all right, what do I do? What do I do? I know in my heart I got to end this, so how do I? And so I looked at my friend, and I said, you're going to pick up the phone. You're going to answer the phone, and you're going to say, this is too much commitment for Jake, and you're going to hang up. And that's what he did. And I never talked to her again. Like, we saw each other at lunch and whatnot, but I never, so don't be like me. Anybody who's like dating right now, please don't do what I did, like just horrible thing. But here's what happened after a few of those interactions with Morgan. I knew, fifth grade me, like there's something I should do. In fact, something I know I need to do, but then like the situation was in front of me where I had to do it. And then I realized, oh, it's gonna be tense, it's gonna be awkward, she might cry, I don't know what to do with that. And we've had those sort of scenarios, whether it's fifth grade boyfriend or girlfriend, or even adult stuff in life, where we go, I know what I need to do. I know what I should do. I know the step I got to take. I know the thing I got to say, but then the moment happens and maybe you cave. Or maybe you do it, but it takes all of your energy to do it. And what's going on within that? I put it in your notes this way. Guys, convictions are easy, but courage is hard. Convictions are easy. Courage is hard. It's easy to say, man, I care about this thing and it matters to me, or I know I should, but it's harder when the situation is in front of you where you start to process all of the different things that it means and what could they say and what might happen and will I keep my job and all those different pieces. It's easy to be in college to say, you know what? I want to make the most of my time here. I want to be good at my job after I graduate, so I'm going to study, and I know I have this exam coming up, but all your friends say, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to have fun and we're going to spend some time doing this, and it's hard in that moment to say, you know what, no, I don't want to do what you're going to do. I need to do this because I know what my convictions are. And we could go on and on. It's easy to have convictions about, man, I want to be able to be somebody that honors people with my words, but then you're in the conversation where people start to kind of gossip and it's kind of interesting to you, and so you want to kind of lean in and maybe ask questions and participate. It's hard to have the courage to speak up, to go, hey, I don't think this is right. It's easy sometimes for us to look at our own life and to say, man, I'm not doing well. Whether Christian or not, like something in my life, my marriage or my job or just my mental health, it's hard to raise your hand and go, I need help. It takes courage to take that step. Why? Convictions are easy. Courage is hard. Same thing is true in Christianity. Right? It's not too hard for us to gather in a space like this and to go, for example, say we're talking about forgiveness, and we all kind of nod our head and go, forgiveness is a good idea. I want to be a forgiving person. I hope people forgive me, but then somebody hurts you or your family and you actually have to go and forgive them. It's hard. Right? Hey, generosity is good. It helps people and it serves my own soul to give away and not just to receive. But then you actually look around and see what everybody else is buying and getting in the house and the car, and then you look at the check that you're about to write and you go, oh. Do you have the courage to actually still give in that moment? And then something happens. I've talked to a decent amount of people about just like living as a Christian and face to face with these sort of things. And I'm like, what do you think's going on? And why is it hard for you to do that? And sometimes here's how the conversation goes. And maybe this is something that happens for you. Where we start to go, yeah, like that's for like the really Christian people. Like the people who are really getting after it, and there's like the people who work for churches and are like super Christians, like they're the ones that'll be like faithful and stand up in anything, and like I'm just figuring it out. And there's this kind of thought process that some people have where it's like it's a personality thing, or like some people have it and I just don't. Like they're type A and they're not afraid of conflict, so like they're good at courage, but like my personality, I just don't do courage. So I have thoughts, but I'll just keep them to myself and I'll just kind of try to be in as much of a bubble as possible. So we start to think it's like a personality trait, or some have it and others don't, but I actually would say that's not true. In fact, there's a quote I want to read to you guys that I think is helpful, that many people confuse courage with fearlessness or bravado. It's not true. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of values that are stronger than your fear. It's not a personality thing. It's not type A versus something else. It's actually, if this quote is true, and I think it is, that there's values within you that you care so deeply about. Let's make this Christian for us this weekend. We care so deeply about God and who He is and what He says that those are just more powerful than the fear that's in front of us. That's courage. See, convictions are easy, courage is hard. But if we take that definition, courage is actually something we can build up or break down. In fact, I put it in your notes that way, that it's not just a stagnant thing, but Christian courage can be built up or broken down every way. And it's not just that it can't every day. And it's not just that it can, it's that it does. It is. Meaning we live in Babylon. It's not like everything in our life is pulling us towards God and thinking about God and doing the things of God and caring about God and worshiping God. They're pulling us often away from that. And so every day we have these moments to either lean into the right things, to build up our values, to spend time with God, or not. Think about it this way. I'm guessing a lot of you at some point in your life had a desire to like go to the gym more or take on a diet or something like that as you kind of reflected on your physique or your health or where you were at. And you know this, that if you go to the gym, let's say that was your goal, and you go one day, it's a little bit easier to go the next day, right? Then you go the second time, and it's a little bit easier to go the third time. And all of a sudden, you've gone for a month, it's a lot easier to go the next month. And all of a sudden, it's like, it's what I do, right? Because going to the gym every time starts to help you go the next time. Same thing's true on the other side. If you have the habit built, but then you just miss a day, then all of a sudden you miss a week and a month. Courage is not too dissimilar. So there's something that's building up in you because you're day after day leaning into who God is, or it's not. Come on, you guys have had moments, I've had moments where we look and we go, why didn't I say the thing I should say? Like, I believe in my soul this, but like, why don't I have the courage to share my faith with my neighbor? Like, why am I so nervous about X, Y, or Z? So let me maybe turn this into a question for us to consider this weekend. And this is kind of the mirror up to yourself, and I want you to be honest. Let me ask you this question. How courageous are you in your Babylons? How courageous are you in your Babylons? Remember, if we're saying Babylon is any environment where following God puts you outside the norm, how courageous are you in those? Let me press this. When admitting you're a Christian and that circle of people will make them think you're weird or awkward or maybe even unloving, what do? When having the conversation with the person you've been dating for a month about physical boundaries because you want to honor God is probably going to put the relationship in jeopardy, what do? When sharing your faith with that person is going to make them realize what you really deeply care about, and it's going to make them realize you're all in on this guy Jesus, and they're going to think you're weird or whatever it is, what do? And sometimes when you're just faced with that thing that nobody will ever know about, it's just you, nobody will hear, maybe it's the thing that you've hidden for a while and you have the chance to do it or not do it, how courageous are you? If you're like me, I think about that question, and maybe there's some areas of my life where I go, man, I feel like I'm doing pretty well, but there's a lot of areas where I look and go, I have some room to grow. And if I'm going to thrive in Babylon, if we're going to thrive in Babylon, if you're going to thrive in your Babylon, then we need to be able to have courage as believers. I think like a church without courage is like a car without wheels. Like it's got a lot of the right stuff, but it's not going anywhere. Like you can sit in your garage and like listen to Taylor Swift if you want, but it's not going where you want it to go. It's not doing what it's designed to do. And guys, if we're Christians and we sit here and we go, yes, agreed, amen, but it doesn't show up outside of here, in essence, we don't have courage, then I would actually say we're cowardly. Guys, convictions without courage is cowardly. And I hope that's sobering to you because it's sobering to me to go, man, do I really believe and do I really live out each day the thing that I should that's going to grow my courage? So as we process this, as we go, man, I need to grow in courage. I need to grow in that in order to thrive in Babylon. Let's look at a story as we've done the last few weeks in the book of Daniel. We're going to see somebody take on a situation that demanded courage, but also we're going to see some of the backstory that led up to it, all right? So grab your Bible if you have one and go to the book of Daniel. It's going to be towards the end of your Old Testament. The Bible's built kind of with two sides, Old Testament, New Testament, and Daniel is within the Old Testament. So go ahead and find Daniel chapter 6, and we'll start there. Before we get to that, I want to give just a little bit of context for what is going on and how I want us to kind of listen to this story. So if you're familiar with kind of the Bible at all, or even not, you've probably heard the story of Daniel and the lion's den. You've probably heard the punchline of it and some of what happens. Maybe you haven't this weekend, it'll be the first time, but instead of maybe just waiting for that moment and that part of the story, which is actually just a little part, I want us to back up and look and go, what sort of person was Daniel leading up to that? What sort of things was he doing? What sort of reputation did he have? And if it's true that courage can be built up or broken down every day, how was he actually doing that as he lived his life? All right, so let's dig in and look at Daniel 6, starting in verse 1. It pleased Darius, who was either the king or like the right-hand man of the king at the time in Babylon, to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. So he's in the C-suite, he's overseeing a bunch of people, he's basically one of the top men in charge. These satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. So Daniel's high up in leadership, and as you can imagine, if you just kind of put yourself in this story for a second, he's high up in leadership, and he's somebody from the outside, right? He's one of those God people that were pulled in, and so people didn't know what to think about him all of the time, right? So we'll see that as we go on in verse 3. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Talk about a positive statement there for Daniel. Like if Daniel's mom had a Honda CRV, you know she'd have like the honor roll sticker on the back. Like, my son is an honor roll student, because Daniel was like killing it. He was killing it. Like he was exceptional. He was amazing. He was everything that person, that Darius and Cyrus wanted him to be. But again, he's an outsider in that area. So let's see how the other people responded. At this, the administrator and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. But, I love this, they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. So in essence, these guys are like, all right, come on. Daniel, we don't really like Daniel. We don't want him to be in charge. We don't want to have the power. So like, let's look through all of the things he's ever done. Like, let's open the pages, see if he's like siphoned off some percentage of money, see if he did this dealing in a wrong way, see if he was ungodly. In essence, in 2021 terms, they're like, let's pull up the emails. Like, let's dig in. Let's look at his search history. And even as you think about that for a moment, I wonder how many of us go, man, I wouldn't want people peering into my life in that way. Because I have a good show publicly, but privately, and the things behind the scenes. So they go, let me look through this, and let me give some context that's incredible to this. If you were here week 1, you remember us telling you Daniel at the time was about 16 years old. Daniel at this time is over 80 years old. He's over 80. And so they weren't just looking at like a couple of years of influence and business dealings and interactions. They were looking at 60 plus years to say, let's flip it back 5 years. Let's flip it back 10 years. Nothing. Talk about somebody day by day by day by day saying, I'm gonna do the right thing. In fact, they said this in the next verse. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So not only was Daniel not a bad guy, he wasn't just a good guy, he was a godly guy. So they're like, hey, he's not just a good person, he's not just not a bad person, but like, all right, he's a godly guy. So if we're gonna catch him on something, if we're gonna get him on some sort of thing, it's gonna be something in the law of God. So let's like poke into that and let's see what we can do as we try to get Daniel out of power, all right? So here's what they do next. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. Let's keep going on and see what they say next. The royal administrators, prefects, and all these government people have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. So like, we know where we can get him. We can get him on the God stuff. We can get him on his faith, because that's the thing he's going to have courage with, and he keeps living out, and so we'll get him on that. I love it says they all agreed. Because here's what happened. They didn't. So if you remember back, Daniel was one of the key administrators in the whole kind of governmental office. So they said, hey, we all came up, we all agreed. So they were lying. They were lying. And now Daniel's going to be in an interesting situation. Let's see how the king responds next. Now, your majesty, issue this decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree into writing. So all of a sudden, Daniel, living for God, known as a guy who's godly, has a chance to look at his life, to look at what he does and go, all right, this is going to get me in trouble. You've been there. All right, if I say this, they're not going to like it. If I do this, it might lose some of my friends. If I stand up for that in the moment, they're going to think I'm awkward and probably not invite me to this stuff. If I spend my money that way, if I'm generous, you start to process all these things. And so Daniel, in the next verse, starts to deal with this. Now, Daniel, when he learned that the decree had been published, so think about this. A godly guy who all of a sudden is being told, basically, if you pray to your God, which we'll find out in a second, he always did in a relatively public way, then you're going to be thrown in the lion's den. So think about being Daniel for a second. Lean into this. He could go to the king who loved him and go, hey, no. I didn't agree to that. It wasn't a fair trial. So let's change the law, right? Or maybe in his head he's going, man, I know we don't push these things through kind of governmentally unless all of us agree on it. So I need to go talk to my buddies who somehow said this without my permissions. Like he has all of these reasonable grounds to go, hey, this is unfair. This is unjust. I didn't have a voice. But what does Daniel do? Let's see next. He went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Edict, decree, just as he had done before. And I love that statement because it shows we could just take the calendar and go to any random day and put our finger on it. You know what would be happening 3 times a day. He'd be on his knees and he'd be praying, giving thanks to God. So you'll see in a moment kind of the lion's den reality of this, but what we often don't think about is what does a person do every single day that leads up to them being able to stand in those moments? He prayed. He sought God. And he gave thanks to God even when his life was going to be on the line. So we're going to skip the next few verses where basically the people come and they see him praying in his room and they go back to the king and they say, hey, king, there's this edict. Are you going to follow through in it? And the king, even though he loves Daniel, says yes, and that he's going to be a man of his word. Let's see what he says in verse 16. So the king gave the order and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Then the king said to Daniel, and he meant this, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. So Daniel's faith got him in the lion's den. The king's distraught about this. We'll see it in the next verse, in verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own ring and with the rings of his nobles so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. The king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. He's distraught. He's going, I didn't want Daniel to end up here, but Daniel had courage. He lived out his faith, and he ended up there. Let's see what happens next. Verse 19. The first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lion's den? So he's not saying like, Daniel, did you like do the jiu-jitsu thing and like kick him in the mouth and like protect yourself? Or Daniel, did you happen to like find your way up the wall and hide in a certain spot? He's like, no, if anybody was going to save you, God was. Like you're a servant of the living God, so if anybody was going to do anything to protect you, it was going to be God. So he addresses them that way because Daniel's known, his reputation is for being godly. And here's what Daniel says in return in the next verse. Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and then he shut the mouth of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. So Daniel was spared. Daniel was saved. Let me have a quick aside for a second to anybody who's not a believer in the room. If you're here and you're not a Christian or you're seeking or you're skeptical, I know stories like this sometimes can maybe be the reason you're like, this stuff is like adult Santa Claus, right? It's crazy. I don't know how people get around this and nod their heads, but here's what we say often here at Grace. If you can believe that a guy died and rose from the grave, you can believe this happened. So if you can believe that Jesus, which there's a ton of historical evidence for this, died and rose again, then certainly has the power to tell the lions to keep their mouths shut for a night. And so I would say, if you're not a Christian and you have doubts and you have questions, that's great, bring them. We love that you're here, but understand, start with Jesus. And if you can believe that, man, you can believe this in a heartbeat. And we believe God does miracles, and we believe God did one here. And he spared Daniel. Let's see what the king does in response. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. So amazing story in terms of Daniel having courage and in terms of him being spared from the lion's den. But I hope you were leaning into all the details along the way where it said he served his God continually. They couldn't find anything against him, which goes to show Daniel day in, day out was doing the right thing, was honoring God, was loving God, was serving God. And then in the moments where he had to stand up for his faith, he could because he had all those little moments before. If I was to sum up Daniel's testimony and look at you and look at me and say, if we're going to thrive in Babylon, not just live in Babylon, thrive in Babylon and have courage, how do we do that? I'd put it to you this way, guys, if we're gonna have courageous faith, then it's gonna be forged by consistent faithfulness. A courageous faith is gonna be forged by consistent faithfulness. Like if you wanna stand up for God in those big moments, then serve God in the little ones. If you want to have the courage to share your faith with your friend and you've wanted to do that for a while, but you just can't muster it up, then just pray every day that God would soften your heart and pray for those who don't know him that they'd come to know him. If you want to have faith in that moment that is courageous, then be consistently faithful. We live in a culture, guys, we live in a culture that wants results like this. We want to lose 20 pounds in a week. We want to get to where we want to get to like right now. And the story of Daniel says, every day, do the right thing. Love God, love people, and when it happens to come to a thing where you're gonna need courage, you know what's gonna be really helpful? A bunch of little moments of courage that you've built up over time. But sometimes we wonder, why am I not a courageous Christian? Why can't I do it? They did. Maybe it's because we're not being faithful in the little things. It's more fun to think about courage in the big moments and to think about making a difference in that way, but are you doing the right thing day in and day out? I think that's Daniel's testimony to us. So courageous faith is forged by consistent faithfulness. In what ways was Daniel faithful? And in what ways do you and I need to be faithful if we're actually gonna have this type of faith? If we're gonna forge a courageous faith. Let's look at two ways. Here's how Daniel, I think, sought God. So if we're gonna have a courageous faith forged by consistent faithfulness, we need to say, I will faithfully seek God, especially when distractions abound. I'll faithfully seek God, especially when distractions abound. You know, it said in the story, he went and he prayed and he sought God as he did every day before. So you can think about all the different moments at work where he's dealing with situations within the kingdom and he's going, nope, I gotta go home and on my lunch break, I'm gonna pray. I'm gonna give thanks to God, I'm gonna seek his wisdom. In essence, in whatever's coming in my life, I'm gonna seek God. He's gonna be my source of truth, my source of wisdom, my source of direction. When I was growing up, I played baseball, and I was really good at baseball until everybody else got good, and then I was not good. I could hit the ball when they threw like one pitch, and when I started throwing curveballs, I was bad. So anyway, what happened when I was playing, and I don't know if this is true all the way up to the major leagues, but you would be in the on-deck circle, which means you were about to bat next. And then you'd go up to the batter's box, and I think if you thought about baseball right now, you'd think, all right, you get in there, and you kind of face like this, and the pitcher's out that way, and he's gonna throw you a ball, and you're gonna hit it. And yes, that does happen, but there's a really important step that happens before that. So before you get in, and you square up, put the bat on your shoulders and look at the pitcher, you'd open up, and you'd look down here, and you'd find the third base coach. And if you guys have ever been at a baseball game and the coach is doing some weird like Morse code on his face, right, this sort of thing, it's because he's giving a signal to the person who's batting as well as the person on base of this is the play you need to run. So I'd look over and he'd be doing certain things and he'd be doing different signals and I'd say, okay, I get to swing away in this one. And I'd go to swing. Next at bat, I'd get up. I'd look down, he'd do a certain thing, okay, that means bunt. So instead of swinging, which I want to do, he's gonna make me bunt, I guess I'll do that. So I'll square up and I'll bunt. Sometimes I'd look over and he'd look back at me and give a signal. He's like, all right, this guy's gonna steal, so you have to swing at whatever it is. Basically, I wouldn't be hitting the ball or doing the thing on my own wisdom or with whatever I wanted to do. I'd look to the coach would give me the orders, I'd look back and I'd do that thing. My question to you is, as you live your life, as life comes at you, as situations in your school, in your friends, with your family, and with your faith, who do you look to? Or are you so busy with life that you're just like this and you're swinging away and you never actually look to get wisdom? So when the situation comes in your job, do you open up and look over here? to say, God, give me wisdom. I don't know what to do. And you read and you pray, and he gives you conviction, he challenges you, you get back in, and you go. Now, the interesting thing about living in Babylon, when you do this and you go and you seek God, there's all sorts of other things you're going to get, right? Because you live in a culture where you're going to get all sorts of other advice, and people are telling you different things and having different values. So when you look, the only option to look at is not God. It's God and about 18 other things. So the question to you and me is, do we actually seek God? And do we faithfully seek God when distractions abound? Let's get practical. How often do you open your Bible? And I don't say this, don't feel guilty. Don't add it up and ask if you're in good standing with God. Just how often do you look and go, I need to seek God in my life, and I know if I don't read his word and hear his truth, I'm going to just start to think a bunch of weird stuff and I'm going to get in a bad place. How often do you open it? Have you? Do you? If you're going to have a courageous faith, it's forged by consistent faithfulness, you better be seeking God to understand his voice. Guys, if we don't have courageous faith and we don't have connection with our Father, it's not going to happen. And I'm afraid what our faith turns into a lot of times is you come here, maybe twice a month, and you hear somebody like me get up and talk about a story like this, and you go, all right, I got my injection of Jesus for the month, so I'm good for October. It's not how it works. And if our church is living on just a week to week or maybe 2 times a month injection of Jesus, then we are missing out immensely, and we're not going to have courage as a church. So are you seeking God with his word? What's your prayer life like? And have you built the rhythm of God, when I'm anxious, I'm going to go to you. God, when I'm struggling, I'm going to go to you. God, when I'm elated and the promotion happens, I'm going to go to you and give thanks to you. Whatever the thing is, have you learned to seek God to say, you're the reason behind it. I need to give you praise, or I need to seek you mountain or valley. Are you seeking him especially when distractions abound? Daniel did. Talk about a distraction when all of a sudden his faith was going to get him in a lion's den. He came back, he prayed, giving thanks to God. So if you want to have courage, a courageous faith, it's going to be forged by consistent faithfulness. Get in your word. Pray. Engage in group life here at Grace where you're going to hear other believers and be faithfully seeking God. Number 2, the second way I think Daniel lived this out in a way that allowed him to be faithful and built courage in him was this, that I'll faithfully serve God, especially when difficulties arise. I'll faithfully serve God, especially when difficulties arise. So this one's maybe obvious from the story that even though he was potentially going to be put to death, he continued to serve God. He didn't just do it when it was easy, when it was convenient, but he continued to do it even when death was in front of him. You know, I'm a dad of 2 boys now. Micah is 19 months now, I think, old, and we just had Gray a little while ago. He's about 6 weeks old now, so I think I got a picture here of them two. See, I knew you guys would say, oh, they're not that nice, all right? They're not that nice. He loves to smash him, so he just gets on top of him, thinks he's hugging him, and then he also likes to slap his brother, so we're working on it, all right? You can pray for me as we're trying to be parents. But this little guy, as any baby does, he just gets up all the time, and he's hungry, and when he's hungry, he gets mad, and he just yells, and so I'm doing one of the middle of the night feeds, and so usually to 1 or 4 a.m. And every time, when I get up, actually I don't get up on my own. My wife has to wake me up because I'll sleep through anything. But she'll wake me up and be like, hey, it's time, you got to go feed him. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, no. And then I'll start to think about this, and I'm sure if you've been in this season of life, you know this. I'm like, I got to wake up in 3 hours and do that thing, and man, I couldn't get to sleep last night very well, and you're tired, and you're trying to figure out any reason, and I have really good prayers at that time. I'm like, God, you shut the mouth of lions, shut the mouth of my son, right? You can do it. You can do it. I'll tell everybody at church how amazing you are if you do it. So I in that moment, I'm like, can I just not? But every parent does this. You get up, and regardless of how you're feeling, regardless of the difficulties of the night before, the next day, I go in, make the bottle, put them on my leg, and I feed them. The next day, similar difficulties, tired, whatever, I go and I feed them. Some of us, I think, are good at serving God as long as there's no friction, as long as there's nothing that you have to lose. As long as there's nothing that on your side of it is going to be maybe different or hard or difficult. I love what Jesus said in Luke 6. He says, basically, if you're going to do good to people who do good back to you, what good is that? Even sinners do that. And then he says, if you know the scriptures a few verses later, love your enemies and do good to them. In essence, love people when it's hard. Don't just love them when it's easy. When you get nice things in return, no. Serve God, especially when difficulties arise. So I'll ask you this question. When's the last time serving God for you actually came at a personal loss and you had the courage to say yes? Maybe it was sharing your faith, where you knew you had the moment and you've been praying about it, and all of a sudden you're with your friend and they're talking the struggle they're going through, and you're like, all right, I think the best way for me to have this conversation is to share my faith. Did you serve God by sharing your faith even when the difficulty was there? What about when finances get hard? And God says, no, you should give first all the time. Do you have the courage to serve God in that way even when difficulties arise? See, Daniel, when this massive difficulty came, if you remember week 1, there was a difficulty then that he had courage into, was consistently faithful, so he had the courageous faith to stand. So are you seeking God, and are you stepping up and actually serving him? Like if I was to survey your closest friends and ask them, like, does that person really love God? Does that person serve God? What would they say? Would they go, oh yeah, all the time, and they do it in this way, and yeah, sometimes it's even a little weird, but here's what they say, or here's what they do. Courageous faith is forged by consistent faithfulness. So are we as a church, and are you faithful to seek God and to serve God, even with distractions and difficulties? You know, the beautiful thing about Christianity is as we have these conversations, and again, if you're like me, you're going, man, my courage meter isn't as high as I want it to be in all the areas of my life. The answer is not try harder. Just like do a little more morality, a little better, and maybe you'll not screw it up next time. That's not the message of Christianity. The message is not dig deeper into yourself and live it out. It's actually dive deeper into the gospel and be transformed by that. And so as we think about courage and the gospel, the good news of Jesus, we need to be reminded of the ultimate example, our Savior, who should give us the just immense amount of courage we'd need to do anything in our life. And I put it in your notes this way, that if we're thinking about courage, there's no greater courage than Christ on the cross. There's no greater courage than Christ on the cross. We'll in a moment reflect on this more. But man, as you think about your Babylons and the real hard stuff within that, you think about standing up for truth in a way that balances grace and truth. You think about loving your friends while also not enabling things that you think are sin if they're Christians, and having those conversations. You think about just trying to honor all the things the Bible tells you to honor. You think about all that sort of stuff, and you're like, oh, it's hard to have courage. Just be reminded of Jesus, who in his situation, with all the different things that were in his face, that were going on, the Babylon of his time, and the way he was consistently faithful. And he had the courage to go to the cross. Again, we'll reflect on that in a moment with our action step, which will be to take communion. But before we get there, let me kind of share a story as we land the plane. You know, we're not unfamiliar with stories that inspire people. I'm guessing you have a person, if I were to say, who's inspired you? You could probably name maybe your mom or your dad or your grandma or this famous person or whatever it is that has inspired you. I was recently watching some different things with the NFL, and there's a guy in the NFL named Shaquem Griffin. And he's been an inspiration to a bunch of young people who have a certain thing going on. And the interesting thing about Shaquem is he had a disease where blood flow is basically like cut off on one of his arms. And so when he was 4 years old, he basically had to have his hand amputated. So his arm just kind of ends at his wrist. And he was enough of an athlete and committed enough to working hard and not believing the lies that he couldn't be successful, that he made his way to, I believe it was UCF, to play Division I college football, and then was drafted by the Seahawks. And so within all of that, he became this picture of like even somebody in a sport where, man, it seems like really necessary that you would have all of your appendages to go do what you got to do in a football game, but he doesn't even have a left hand, and he got drafted in the NFL, and there's all these stories, and you could look it up of different kids hearing that story and seeing that and being like, Shaquem's my hero. Like I have this issue and I don't have an arm or a leg, or it's been amputated, and I thought like I couldn't do stuff, but I see Shaquem and I know I can. Like I see Shaquem and I know I can keep fighting, and it's a lie when somebody says I can't. And it's a lie when I believe that. In fact, there's a family who came and talked to Shaquem and met him. And there was an interview where this dad of a son who had a similar thing with his arm. And the dad was talking to Shaquem, and then he talked to the reporter after, and they're like, why was this significant to you? And I captured the quote of it, and he said, as he was just tearing up, we just don't want people to tell me he, my son, can't do things. Shaquem proved you can overcome and you can do it. For my son to have someone to look up to say, I can do what he did, that's the most special thing for us. He's like, to have an example, to be reminded when sometimes I don't even believe it myself, that like, I can do it. That's the most special thing. And I'd say one of the most special things for us as Christians is that as we face living in Babylon and trying to have courage in moments, we have an example we can look to say, I can do what he did. It's Jesus. Jesus was faithful in the garden when he was wondering, is there another way? He said, your will be done. He was faithful. He was faithful when somebody drug a cross to him and all of a sudden he had to carry it to the place where he would be murdered. He had the courage to look and say, this is all unfair. I don't deserve it. And I created all of this. And he had courage to let a nail go in, crown of thorns on his head. We can look and go, I can be like that. Not because we're strong, not because we're special, but because he's powerful. Because the same Spirit who rose him from the dead is alive in us if we're believers. So if we're going to have courageous faith, it's built by consistent faithfulness. Let's look at Jesus. And our action step this weekend is to do something we do every once in a while here at Grace, is to take communion. And this is for those of us who call ourselves Christians. And if you're not a Christian, just kind of engage this by watching and seeing this. And we're going to take it here in a moment, not right now, but the band's going to lead us in a moment through a song. And you're going to stay seated. And I just ask that you would, as much as you can, think about Jesus. Think about what he's done. Think about who he is. Think about the courage that it took to take the steps that he took. And I know we all have our things, we all have our stuff, we all have our situations, we all have our Babylons. Let's just put that to the side for a second and go, Jesus, I need to focus on you. I need to worship you. I need to become in awe of you. And I'll come back out after the team leads us for a few minutes and we'll take communion together. All right, let's pray and prepare our hearts this time. Father God, we don't want to have convictions without courage. God, you don't call us to agree with things in private and then just live a life that looks no different than everybody else in public. But God, the whole point of this conversation, this series, is to say it's hard, it's difficult, and it's challenging. So Jesus, as we think about your hard and difficult and challenging, I pray we would be reminded of the suffering that you took willingly. I pray we would be reminded of your obedience to the Father to the point of death. I pray we'd be reminded of your goodness that didn't deserve any of this, but yet you allowed it to happen for the glory of the Father and for the potential salvation of all of us. Jesus, we need courage. You're our ultimate example. Would we reflect on that? Would you draw our hearts to you in that moment today? It's in Jesus' name.